The town of Oakhaven was a place of forgotten light. At the center of this desolation stood Father Thomas, a man whose skin was as weathered as the stones of his own cathedral. Thomas was not a man of grand ambitions. He was a man of grand empathy. For years, he had offered prayers that seemed to vanish into the rafters of the Oakhaven Cathedral. His devotion remained a brittle thing. He looked at the heavens and saw only leaden clouds, a silent vault that offered no comfort to the dying. Then came the shadow that no prayer could dispel. A mysterious plague, swift and merciless, descended upon the Oakhaven orphanage. It was a cruel affliction that targeted the most vulnerable, turning the laughter of children into labored gasps for air. Thomas spent his days and nights wiping fevered brows and holding small, trembling hands. He watched the light fade from the eyes of the innocent. Each time a small body went still, Thomas felt a piece of his faith chip away. He screamed at the silent statues of saints, demanding why the guiltless were being harvested while the wicked prospered. He was a shepherd watching his lambs be slaughtered, and his staff felt useless in his hands. The air in the orphanage grew thick with the scent of lavender and rot. For 3 days and 3 nights, Thomas sequestered himself within the sanctuary of the cathedral. He knelt before the altar until his knees bled, his voice hoarse from pleading for a miracle that refused to manifest. On the 3rd night, his sorrow finally boiled over into a desperate defiance. He threw his crucifix across the marble floor, the sound of silver hitting stone echoing like a gunshot. "If heaven will not hear me," he roared into the empty void, "then let the shadows listen. I would give anything to save them. Anything." The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. Then, from the deepest shadows of the transept, a man emerged. He was not a monster, but a charismatic figure in a sharp, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the candlelight. Before we continue this dark tale of Oakhaven, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Mr. Thorne moved with a predatory grace, his smile a thin line of polished ivory. He explained that he was a merchant of possibilities. He did not want Thomas's soul. That would be too simple. Instead, he offered a covenant of blood. Thorne proposed that Thomas become his harvester on earth. For every life restored in the orphanage, Thomas would eventually have to deliver another soul to the darkness. It was a balance of accounts, a grim arithmetic of existence. Thomas looked at the man, his mind reeling. At that moment, a frantic nun burst into the cathedral, sobbing that the youngest child had stopped breathing. Thomas looked at the parchment Thorne held, a dark, ancient thing that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Without another word, he bit his thumb and pressed his bloody digit against the bottom of the contract. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of warmth surged through the town, and from the direction of the orphanage, the sound of weeping was replaced by a sudden, impossible silence. Thomas rushed back to find the children sitting up, their skin flushed with health and their eyes bright. Exhausted, Thomas returned to his private quarters and caught sight of himself in a small, cracked mirror. Where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 pits of infinite, swirling ink. Thorne appeared one last time in the corner of the room, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. The debt had been established, he whispered, and the first collection would be due in exactly 7 days. Thomas realized then that the price of life was far more terrifying than the finality of death. The first 7 days passed in a blur of terrifying reverence. The news of the children's recovery spread through the valley, and within months, Oakhaven was no longer a dying town. It became a destination for the broken and the desperate. Thomas moved through the crowds like a ghost, his ink-black eyes hidden behind dark spectacles. He could feel the vibrancy of the town, but to him the air always tasted of iron and winter. Every time he laid hands on a diseased chest, he felt a jolt of power that wasn't his own, followed by a sickening, hollow echo. He was a vessel for a grace that was borrowed and tainted. Prosperity had a shadow. As the blind began to see, strange tragedies began to pockmark the news. A carpenter vanished without a trace. A healthy young woman died in her sleep. Thomas knew the truth. In his dreams, he saw the faces of these victims and realized he had noticed them in the crowd just days before. His subconscious mind, fueled by the contract, was picking the fruit for Thorn's harvest. He was marking the sheep for slaughter simply by noticing them. The town thrived on blood money, though they knew it not, and the price of their health was paid in the currency of souls. The physical toll was agonizing. Whenever Thomas considered confessing, a searing pain would radiate from his thumb, crawling up his arm like liquid fire until it squeezed his heart. He withdrew into the sanctuary of the cathedral, shunning the people who worshipped him. He was no longer a priest, he was an accountant of souls, balancing a ledger that grew bloodier with time. His prayers had become empty recitations of words that felt like ash in his mouth. He feared his own reflection, for the blackness was beginning to leak into his very thoughts. Deacon Elias, Thomas's closest friend, first pierced this isolation. One evening, Elias stumbled upon the secret. In a hidden drawer lay a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a record of tithes, but a list of names of the deceased, tallied against the dates of Thomas's miracles. Beside each name was a smear of blood. Elias begged Thomas to explain, pleading with his friend to repent even if the miracles ceased. The deacon's eyes were wide with a terror that only a man of God could feel. Before Thomas could find the words to lie, the air curdled. Mr. Thorne stepped from behind a curtain, his presence extinguishing the candles. He didn't look at Elias, he looked at Thomas, his smile wider than ever. Thorne's eyes were like burning embers in the gloom. He reminded the priest that the debt was due and pointed a gloved finger at the deacon. Thorne gave Thomas a choice. Allow Elias to be taken, or the protection over the orphanage would be stripped away. The plague would return, Thorne promised, 10 times more virulent than before. The silence was heavy with damnation. Thomas looked at Elias, the man who had shared his burdens for decades. Then he thought of the children. Self-preservation and a twisted sense of duty warred within him, but the darkness in his eyes won. He lowered his head, a silent signal of surrender. The shadows in the room detached themselves from the walls, swarming around Elias like a cloud of sentient ink. The deacon didn't even have time to scream. He simply dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing but the scent of incense and cold stone. Thomas collapsed into his chair, the silence now absolute. Hours later, he noticed a piece of paper where Elias had stood. It was a letter Elias had been writing to the Vatican, a petition to recognize Thomas as a living saint, detailing his divine grace. Thomas clutched the letter as a sob broke through his cold exterior. He had sacrificed the only soul who still truly believed in his goodness, ensuring his survival at the cost of the last shred of light he had left. He was now truly alone, a haunted saint of the shadows, darkly presiding over a gilded town that was vibrant on the outside but rotting from the inside out. Years bled into decades, and the humble priest of Oakhaven was now Bishop Thomas, a man whose name was whispered with awe across the continent. Oakhaven had transformed into a shimmering jewel of the Gothic world. Yet, beneath the veneer of prosperity, a peculiar stillness had settled. There were no hospitals because there was no sickness. No graveyards were filled because no one seemed to age. But as Thomas looked out from his balcony, he saw a haunting truth. The people moved with a mechanical precision, their faces frozen in masks of contentment. There was no joy in their laughter, no fire in their eyes. They were a flock of the living dead, preserved in a state of perpetual hollow grace. Thorn arrived on a night when the wind screamed through the gargoyles. He looked no older, his suit still absorbing the light. He sat in the bishop's chair, eyes reflecting flickering shadows. He informed Thomas that the covenant was reaching its end. To ensure the town's continued blessing, a final payment was required. Thomas was to stand before his congregation during the grand midnight mass and publicly renounce his faith, desecrating the high altar with his own blood. Thorn demanded a final, public victory over the Creator's light. Thomas walked through the orphanage that night, now a palace of marble. He looked at the children he had sold his soul to protect. They were adults now, physically perfect, yet as they looked at him, he saw the terrifying void. Their eyes were like his own, bottomless pits of ink. He realized with a crushing weight that he had never saved them. He had merely preserved their physical forms to serve as vessels for Thorn's influence. He hadn't been a savior, he had been the butcher's assistant. The midnight mass was a spectacle of gold and incense. Thousands gathered, their voices raised in a hollow chant. Thomas climbed the pulpit, his bishop's robes heavy with sin. Mr. Thorn stood in the shadows, his predatory smile expectant. But as Thomas looked at the sea of empty faces, something long dormant flickered. Instead of the scripted renunciation, he began to speak of the darkness. He confessed every name in his ledger, every drop of blood, and every secret betrayal. He spoke of Elias and the children, peeling back the golden facade of Oakhaven to reveal the rotting core beneath. The congregation sat in a stunned silence as the bishop's voice cracked with a decade's worth of grief. As Thorn moved to intervene, Thomas grabbed a heavy silver thurible filled with burning coals and swung it into the velvet tapestries. He had spent his final hours preparing a forbidden rite, a way to bind the entire debt of Oakhaven to his own body. Thomas stood at the altar, not as a saint, but as a repentant sinner, offering himself as a final sacrifice to break the infernal chain. Thorn screamed, his human mask dissolving into shadows as he tried to claim Thomas's soul before the fire could finish its work. But Thomas only smiled, a genuine expression of peace he hadn't felt since the plague first arrived. He vanished into the inferno as the dome collapsed inward. The golden age of Oakhaven had been a long, beautiful lie, and the fire was the only truth left. When the sun rose, the townspeople woke as if from a heavy dream. The unnatural vitality was gone. They felt the ache of age and the sting of cold, but for the first time in years, they were free. Weeks later, a young priest arrived at the blackened ruins. Amidst the ash, a single black rose grew, its petals like velvet midnight. He knelt and found a small, glinting golden coin. The new priest did not know the history of the ground beneath his feet, nor the price paid for the silence that now reigned. As he pocketed it, a sharply dressed stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing, tipping his hat with a polite, predatory smile. The cycle was ready to begin anew.